Hi and welcome to the first edition of the Dialectic Report. Since it is my first edition, I would like to outline the aims I have for my YouTube channel and for the bi-weekly Dialectic Report. The main aim of my channel is to provide a contextual, wholesome analysis of what's happening around the world, rather than the segmented, partial images that we're being flooded with by the mainstream media and Associated Press. So what my aim is to do is to scour the media outlets and scour the news and pick out what I think are the more important news that the media tends not to cover, and to give an understanding of how that news interrelates with all the other phenomena that's going on. And ultimately, down the weeks and months, hopefully years of the channel, you'll understand the broader interrelations that are going on between monetary easing, or the quantitative easing that we're having, conflict in Iraq, Syria and Libya, the Eurozone troubles, and the ongoing new Cold War between the US allies against Russia with all the sanctions. So that's the main outline. For the first episode, I will concentrate mainly on oil. It's a phenomenon that's been grabbing the headlines. It initially began as a supply problem. So a few months the mainstream media said, "Oh, it's no big deal. All it is that there's an oversupply of it in the world," and they blamed it on ISIS, and they said, "Well, they've kind of just muddied the waters and they've oversupplied, and that's all that's happening. So nothing to worry about. There's nothing structurally there's nothing structurally wrong with the global economy. It's just a couple of teenagers, runaway teenagers in Syria and Iraq that are kind of causing the troubles." Well, a few months down the line, we're still having low oil prices, so that can only mean one thing. It's a demand issue as well. I do agree there is an oversupply, there is no doubt, but the fact that the low price have remained means that it's not being cleared at the low price, so there isn't demand for the low price to get it back up to where it was. So it's also a demand issue. That is quite terrifying and frightening, to know that we're still in the death throes of the Great Depression that we were plunged into in 2007. And despite all the hurrahs of recovery and the green shoots of recovery that we've been hearing, the reality remains that we're in the Great Depression, and will continue to be so for some time to come. So without further ado, let's plunge into our first headline. I got the first two headlines from oilprice.com. It's a great site, gives you great insight into what's happening in the oil sector, the global oil sector. And the first article is by Tully, and it's called "Iran Leader Says US is Not the Only Target of Suspected Saudi Oil Price War." What does that mean? There has been rumours going around, quite well-founded rumours, that Saudi Arabia has felt the sharp edge of competition from the booming US shale economy, the booming US shale sector. And Saudi Arabia used to be the world's top exporter of oil before the United States overtook it. Now, what Andrew Tully is implying is that essentially that is true, that the Saudis are trying to oversupply the market, Saudi being one of the biggest OPEC members and one of the largest producers of oil in the world, that they are trying to oversupply the global oil market to suppress the price and to essentially kill off the American shale sector. Now, I would like to clarify this point, why it can do that and what American shale is. American shale boom, or gas or oil, is essentially it's oil that's deeper in the ground. So it's a far more capital intensive, far more expensive endeavor to get the liquid out of that far into the mantle of the earth. So the reason why I think Saudis have realized that they can do that is namely because of its capital intensive nature. Now, what does that mean? Capital intensive means that it requires more machinery to get the stuff out of the ground. Well, what does that mean? That means it's more expensive. So it's not state funded. So the various independent companies, American shale oil companies and shale gas companies, have to borrow. Now, I think the heart of darkness lies in debt. I think the Saudi leadership has realized that there's a lot of debt being accumulated by the American shale business. So what it decided to do was to suppress the oil price to a level where it ceases to be profitable for American producers, but not so for the rest of the OPEC nations. Now we've had record low interest rates in here in America. The Federal Reserve has kept them like that since I think the onset of Alan Greenspan, who has kept interest rates low for a long time now. Now what does that mean? It means that oil companies in America, since I think turn of the century, could borrow money at near 0% to finance this booming sector. And we only came into its full in kind of late 2000s after the Great Recession, as a response to kind of job creation. Now it only did that at the expense of debt. So these companies accrued heavy levels of debt, partly to blame for was the cheap money. So there was a lot of cheap money going around, and that is still going around today. But they accrued high levels of debt to finance this venture. Now that was based on the old $120 barrel of oil. Now that's decreasing rapidly. So I think the main strategy of Saudi is to essentially kill off its competitor, because it can survive the lower price levels, because it's for most of the OPEC countries, the oil is far easier to reach. It's relatively less capital intensive, and it's less leveraged. Now, Andy Tully's article is very interesting, because the main point of his article is that the Iranian leadership says it's not only there to punish America, but it's only there to punish Iran. Now, this is where we get into kind of the murky waters. The Iranian president said that it's mainly to do with sectarian reasons, Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi. And now he's saying that they're trying to kill two birds with one stone, crush the American domestic shale sector by essentially burying it under losses, and also to hit the Iranian sector, oil sector. Now, whether I believe it to be true or not is a different matter. I do think there is a certain sectarian scent to all this. I do definitely agree to that extent. But I do think that there is a lot of conflict that arose when America decided for Iran to be the regional hegemon of the region, to mainly tackle ISIS. So I think what happened was that Saudi felt deeply betrayed by the idea of the US giving so much leverage and regional power to Iran, a Shia powerhouse in the Middle Eastern region. And I'll cover this later on, but one of the main agreements between Saudi Arabia and the US is the petrodollar, that oil can only be sold and bought at the dollar value, using the dollar currency. Again, I'll go over this in slight detail later on, but the main tenet of the global economy since the 1970s is the petrodollar. Now, the US has been shirking on its side of the bargain by backing Shia Iran. Now the deeply Sunni Saudi feels betrayed at that. So what it's trying to do is punish them both. And I think that's why Andy Tully's article is pointing at. That it's trying to punish Saudi's trying to punish Shia for essentially receiving the hegemon, the kind of the regional hegemon role, and America for ascribing it that and attributing it that. Personally, I think that's a rather dangerous development. I think that is not conducive to recovery. But there you are. That's the state we're in. The second article from oilprice.com is Oil Wars: Why OPEC Will Win by Roger Williams. It's a rather short article, but I think the main crux of it that he's trying to elucidate is the fact that OPEC nations will win the battle of the oil price when set against the American producers. The simple reason he gives is that for OPEC countries, oil revenue is not only economic, or it's not only economical, but also political. OPEC countries such as Venezuela, the rest of the kind of Gulf states, use oil revenues to help subsidize social programs, subsidies for food, subsidies for the other sectors. They also give foodstuffs. So there's a real infrastructural emphasis on kind of the social arrangements. So it's a political motif that the OPEC countries have. America is only economical. If it goes below the level, if the price drops below the production costs for a certain period of time, a lot of shale companies in America will default because they're highly leveraged. There's a lot of debt involved, and they will not be able to keep up this interest payments, let alone the principal on them. So I think those are two crucial developments. The fact that we're having a war right now between OPEC and the US, and OPEC will eventually win because the cost for the OPEC countries is civil unrest, civil war, perhaps a new coup d'etat, whereas for America it's purely economic. So I do think that's a development worth keeping in mind. The second one is an interview between David Hughes. The third piece of the third article that we'll relate to is an interview between David Hughes, a key geologist who studied the energy resources of Canada for 40 years, and Chris Martenson of Peak Prosperity. Now, the reason why I chose this article or this interview was what David Hughes had to actually say about the American shale oil industry. The overall crux of his argument, and it's a very good one at that, and it's very well qualified. It's very well qualified to make it. Is that it's sensationally overhyped. The domestic capacity of the domestic shale industry in America is incredibly overhyped. He's the publisher of the report that's called Drilling Deeper, and in the interview with him and Chris Martenson, he actually says, when you add up the production in 2040 in the Bakken, the Eagle Ford, these are the two oil wells in America, by the way, these are one of the big oil wells that they found. When you add up the production in 2040 in the Bakken and the Eagle Ford compared to the IEA, the Energy Information Agency, when you compare to the Energy Information Agency forecast for the Bakken and the Eagle Ford, mine are less than a tenth of the production in 2040. What he says though is when the government agency, the EIA, the Energy Information Agency, when he compares his forecast to the amount of oil that these big American oil fields can produce, is 1/10 of the forecast given by the government agency, by the EIA. So he's, just to reiterate, he's very well qualified, and the important part is that he actually uses real actual data from the existing wells in America in the shale sector, and he uses reliable models and copious amounts of data. Please visit, I'll drop a link below, please visit the website Peak Prosperity and just have a listen to the conversation. And to him, it's a scandal that it's so highly overhyped. And he actually says that in his report, he underestimates short-term production. So what he means by that is that in his conservative estimate of it being 1/10 of the report, even within his conservative estimate, he underestimates short-term production. So he's saying that short-term production won't be too bad, so it'll be quite low, short-term production, and it'll kind of carry on in the later years. But the problem we've had lately is that oil prices have been so low that America has been pumping oil like crazy just to keep up production and to keep up servicing the interest payments and kind of getting whatever levels of profit it can. So I think it's looking even worse for the domestic shale industry. I think Saudi Arabia is winning. It knows that it has to essentially pump up more and more and more at deeper and deeper levels, commit more and more capital intensive machinery to keep the same production level, to keep production flat. So I think David Hughes says that America kind of peak oil, or the kind of peak production in American shale industry will occur in 2020. I think you'll have to admit that it'll probably be before that, namely because of short oil prices. Now, this was before the oil crisis actually happened, the low oil prices. So it won't be an outrageous guess to say that the peak production of American shale industry will come in the next year or 2 or 3, and after that it'll cost more and more and more for them to dig out the deeper and deeper oil that's in there. So these are hugely important developments that have occurred. What does that mean in terms of? I would like to kind of conclude on what does that mean in terms of the American economy and the global and the larger geopolitical space. Well, part of it is the fact that Saudi Arabia does feel a lot of resentment towards America, which is why I think the move came. It's very clever it was very politically clever to do so for them, namely because they realised once they reduced the oil price to a certain level, American oil companies have no other choice but to increase production. So it kind of becomes a trap that kind of the shale companies find themselves in. They can't, essentially, they're price takers. They can't influence price, and they have to keep production as much as they can just to keep afloat. And I think the low interest rates set by the Federal Reserve, by the ECB, by the Bank of England have helped re-pump that bubble. And there are further pieces of bad news to come. The first of them is in a Bloomberg report, which says that there is a high level of junk bonds in the energy sector. What are junk bonds? A company will essentially make public bonds, so it'll issue out bonds which are essentially debt. So it'll say, give us your money, to the public or to whoever. It'll say, we will give you a certain amount of interest every year, and we'll give you the whole sum at the end of a certain period, say 10 years or 20 years. So because of the cheap money that's been flying around, namely by the QE programs, by the quantitative easing, which is a separate video that I'll cover, but quantitative easing along with low interest rates meant that these companies, these shale companies, kind of essentially can borrow at near zero interest rates and issue these junk bonds. And the reason why they're junk is because it's unprofitable for them to maintain an operation that costs them so much. These shale fields have oil so deep that the actual production costs of pumping out oil is so great that it's just highly unprofitable for them. So there's a huge amount of junk bonds floating around the system that will get exposed once prices go even lower. And in the Bloomberg report, it actually says that they're estimating that the default rate on these junk bonds will reach 8% in 2015. I think it'll be a lot higher. Now, what the implications of that is that once these junk bonds that will never ever be paid back, so once these companies essentially accrued all the money from the public and from the QE programs to dig out all the oil, once they go bankrupt, which eventually they will, that could have essentially repercussions for the whole system at large. Because if they're unable to pay that, then the creditors will have lent out the money that they were meant to receive from the junk bonds, which could essentially trigger a whole new cascading defaults further on. And there's another CNN report, the CNN headline, which says tumbling oil could take thousands of jobs with it. So I think we have a very dangerous development in the oil sector today. 15% of total employment gain in America has been in the energy industry. Now, if it indeed does happen that we're going to have mass defaults in the American shale sector, which we will, if prices maintain at this level, then that could trigger further cascading defaults, namely because these junk bonds will be lent out to other people. So these junk bonds will be securitized. In other words, someone else will take these junk bonds that will never be paid back, and they'll sell them to other unsuspecting members of the business community or the public, and they'll say, right, these are great AAA bonds of debt, and they will definitely be paid back. The shale sector is booming. We're having a new revolution in energy in America, and do for patriotic reasons. So people pressured on patriotic reasons will buy these junk bonds, and they'll be sold on, and then someone along the line will sell them on. So if the initial bond isn't repaid, all the kind of chains after that will default too. So it's an inherently destabilizing force in the financial system, which could bring it all down. I do think the American leadership will halt it. They can see it coming, so they'll do anything they can to prevent it from happening. So I think we have to essentially keep our fingers crossed and hope that oil prices will go up to essentially halt another crash from coming. Thank you very much for listening to this first edition of the Dialectic Report, and I'll have my second video coming out very soon. Thank you very much.